The issue we're about to hear from Tripp is probably the #1 in the minds of legislators and the governor. Transportation funding. How are we going to build a sustainable transportation network, one that doesn't fall into disrepair, and how are we going to fund that endeavor? And I will say that Tripp has done tremendous work, both at the big picture level, looking at the statewide transportation plan, and statewide transportation funding mechanisms, one of a handful of experts in that we have within the conservation world, and also at the project level, looking at specific projects like the proposed new US 460 and 29 bypass outside of Charlottesville, which may be of particular importance to you and the communities where you live. So we're grateful to have Tripp with us to shed some light on this convoluted issue, which I know your lawmakers want to hear about when you meet with them. Thanks, Tripp.
Good morning. It's great to be with you all. I have plenty of other questions about uranium as well. We could have gone on for hours about just the uranium alone. And now another non-controversial, simple topic of transportation funding. As Nathan said, this is probably at the forefront of most legislators' mind and the governor's mind, and we are going to be hearing a whole lot about transportation funding in the next few months and going forward, because that is not going to be the end of it. I'd like to give you just a quick overview of what we're likely to see, some of the key issues this session, some of the key things that VCN will have in play. There's more in the briefing books that are passed out. There are several papers dealing with transportation in there that we worked on, one on transportation funding more broadly, one on passenger rail, and another one on the Public-Private Transportation Act, and then a broader one on smart growth. So there's a number of things in the briefing book that have more information. And I'll also be around later today to answer additional questions and have further discussion, and then beyond. So there's no way we're going to get through with so much of this morning, but I want to just give you a quick overview. Because it is going to be a dominant issue this session. And transportation funding, surprise, surprise, is going to be at the center of a lot of our debate for probably about the 10th or 11th session in a row. So this is, we've had a number of sessions, special sessions, and ongoing discussions. We have mainly just kicked the can down the road each time. So here we go again. There's a subset of this discussion that's going to get some extra traction, I think, this session on passenger rail funding, as well as on transit funding and the allocation of transit funds. Then there's also the ongoing issues with Virginia's Public-Private Transportation Act, which I'll say more about in a moment, and the broader issues of the following. Another fundamental issue that will be in the background, if not in the foreground of a lot of these discussions, is how much is the state responsible for, and how much can they shift off to localities to pick up. And so that comes under the sort of devolution framework. And finally, I'm not going to talk at all about this really today. We're going to talk more about just the funding picture, because I think that is going to be front and center. But there are likely to be some legislation and some key issues more broadly about transportation policy, structure, VDOT, how things work on the policy side. But the real core issue is going to be the money. And what's driving a lot of this is the maintenance needs that we have statewide. Virginia, unlike most states, the state maintains most of the secondary roads as well as the highways. So Virginia's highway system and what the state is responsible for is one of the largest in the entire country as a result. And these costs to maintain these roads are growing. There are some estimates that it's about $4 billion is what the price tag is to bring roads and bridges up to snuff. Some of the most recent numbers that are about 1/5 of the interstate miles and over 1/3 of the miles of our secondary roads are not in adequate condition today. Obviously with maintenance, this is something you can never totally catch up on. They're continuing, it's a continuing need, and it's one that we have not funded sufficiently, even though we have put a fair amount of money into it. Virginia's actually better than a lot of states in terms of percent of our transportation budget goes to maintenance. But as a result of this growing need, that's part of the pressure for additional funding, and we have been transferring some extra money into the maintenance accounts because it's not adequate to meet these needs. And that's what's really driving a lot of the talk about the transportation funding debate, is the fact that a lot of the decision makers are looking for more money. They're less concerned about maintenance and more concerned about building new highways. Now, you'll hear a lot of need figures thrown around about how much the gap is between current revenues and our transportation needs. A lot of those are some pretty inflated figures because they include a lot of high price tag projects that, frankly, we think, BCN and Birmingham, we think, are totally boondoggles. They're a waste of money, incredibly environmentally destructive, are going to continue a pattern of dependence on automobile and continue the pollution and other patterns that we've seen. So I think when you hear some of those numbers, take them with a grain of salt. Among other things, for example, they include $1.4 billion for a new Highway 460, which would run 55 miles right next to our existing 460, which is one of the most underused roads in Virginia. So those numbers are overstated, take with a grain of salt, but there is no question that we are going to need some additional revenues. The federal funding picture, we're seeing the most recent reauthorization of the Federal Surface Transportation Law is flat on the funding. We're not likely, given the current budget situation, to see significant additional influx of transportation funding. And another thing that's really driving a lot of this debate is that the primary state source of revenue for transportation is the gas tax, which has not been raised in quite a while. So its purchase power has been declining, but even more importantly, as we're finally moving, thankfully, to more efficient vehicles, the amount of gas purchases, and as we're moving to alternative fuel vehicles, it's not a very stable revenue source when you look out into the future. So that's what's leading to a lot of the angst about our funding levels and why we need more money. In addition to, frankly, politicians love to cut ribbons on new highways, and they're worried that we're not going to have enough to do that. So one estimate is that by 2017, there will not be any state money for construction. Now, sometimes you'll hear in the press and people will say, we're going to run out of money for construction in Virginia by 2017. That's not correct. We would still get federal funding, and that's where a lot of our money comes from. But there wouldn't be state money to fully leverage the federal dollars that are available. So that's a little bit of a nuance, but important to know when people say we're running out of money. VDOT's budget this year is about $5 billion. We're not running out of money for transportation, but there is this squeeze coming. There is a need for more revenue. In the last few years, to meet the gaps that do exist, there hasn't been any money pretty much going into local roads from the state. So the secondary and urban road money, there's been very little, and there's been a reduced state share for transit. And transit obviously has taken a big hit amidst this, with soon some service cuts as well as fare hikes. So that's kind of the big picture. I think there is no question, and I think it's a mistake for us to argue that there isn't a need for additional revenue. And the big question really is, where's that revenue going to come from, and how are you going to spend it? That's, I think, much more where the debate needs to focus. I'd like to step back to the last two sessions just to give you a sense of where we've been, because this has been a recurring issue. This dynamics about the state of the gas tax and the maintenance needs is nothing new. We've known this for years. So the General Assembly and the Governor just 2 years ago put an additional almost $4 billion into the transportation plans. Almost all of that was accomplished by maxing out the state's credit card. So it was not done much through a new revenue source. It was done through primarily accelerated borrowing that either the General Assembly had already authorized, that we moved up, and the other thing is we're borrowing against our future federal transportation dollars. So a lot of this was borrowed money, but it did give this big slug of money for a while. The other thing that happened in the last couple of years is a little bit more of the surplus funding has been earmarked for transportation. That's something VCN and a number of you in the room have worked on this issue. There have also been a number of other attempts to raid the general fund, to take the money, one of the most attractive pots of money for a lot of politicians when you need more money for transportation, and you're averse to raising any taxes, is you try to take money from the general fund, which means less money for the pittance we have for environmental protection. It also means less money for schools, police, and a whole host of other needs. So those attempts largely have not been successful, but that's been a focal point of the battles the last few years and will be again. There have been a number of creative, some would say, kind of slightly crackpot ideas that have been tossed out in the last few years as they've gotten more desperate to come up with additional money for transportation without a tax hike, among other things, the fight over ABC privatization, creating a new state tolling authority, naming rights for bridges and roads. Some of those have gotten through a little bit. It hasn't been all bad news, so one thing that we were successful, and VCN, a number of groups worked on in the last session, is we got an additional $57 million in the budget for passenger rail. So there have been some good news amidst mainly the defense we've had to play the last few sessions. But amidst this, there's no question the current administration's focus is on road construction. As I mentioned, that slug of money that came from borrowing created the last 6-year plan had a lot more money to work with. Well, what did they do? 2.4 billion additional monies went to highway construction, 0.2 billion went to rail and transit. So you can see the relative priorities where your tax dollars are being spent. And where a lot of that money has gone and is going are to some particularly destructive projects, which I know many of you in the room are working on some of these. Just to name a few of the greatest hits of this administration is working on the Charlottesville bypass, elements of the Outer Beltway, the Washington Transportation Corridor, Tri-County Parkway, a number of related projects in Northern Virginia and Piedmont, the Coalfields Expressway, I-81, again, proposals to do more doubling segments of that are back on the table. Various hot lane projects, 495, 95, 395, brand new 460, which I mentioned. The upshot is that that big slug of new money is almost all now spoken for. Just recently, a couple of months ago, when the Commonwealth Transportation Board, that supposedly is the independent body overseeing transportation in Virginia, transferred a big slug of that additional money to the new 460. One of ZT Baby Merge remarked, well, that's basically it. We've now spent all that additional money the General Assembly gave us just 2 years ago. Borrowing against the future, that money is now almost all spoken for. As a result, we don't have meaningful choices in transportation in Virginia, alternatives to driving. I mentioned the hit that transit has taken. I'll say a little bit more about some additional pressures on transit funding. That's to say nothing about the hit of bicycle and pedestrian funding. In Virginia, in the past, the dominant focus has been roads. I mentioned the last, that additional, we saw the relative perspective of the new money, almost overwhelmingly the one highway construction. It's where, unfortunately, our state tax dollars have gone. That's why I'm saying it's so important in this debate, which typically is focusing on how do we raise the revenue. What is missing from this debate largely, and what we continue to try to bring to this debate in the last few years, and will continue to try to do and urge you all to focus on, is how is that money spent? Remind the General Assembly, they just put $4 billion additional dollars in 2 years ago, and that's gone, and what do we have to show for it? So it's not just the money, it's how's that money spent. At the same time that we're sliding alternatives to driving, there's an enormous pent-up demand, and I'm not going to go into this in detail, but it's important to know, I think, to make help our advocacy, it is that from everything from shifts in demographics to people reacting to higher gas prices, you name it, there are a whole lot of factors that are driving much greater demand for alternatives to driving. Even though we're not putting our tax dollars there yet, that's what people are voting with their feet in their pocketbooks. Just to give a few examples, 2 of the 3 fastest growing state-supported rail services in the entire country in the last couple of years have been in Virginia. Enormous increase in rail ridership, just the limited services that we have. VRE, transit have also seen high ridership. Some of our newer services, such as the Lynchburg, Charlottesville, the DC train, has more than doubled the original estimates. Norfolk Light Rail has greatly exceeded estimates. People want transportation choices, cleaner, more affordable, more practical transportation options. We're not giving it to them. So that needs to be a fundamental part of this transportation debate in any transportation proposals going forward. So turning quickly to this session, what can you expect? VCN, as I mentioned, there's a paper on transportation funding in the book. Our position fundamentally is 5 components. Any transportation funding, whatever it is, bill, budget amendment, whatever you do, should have 5 parts. Number 1, the number got dropped off, but it's still number 1, is fix it first, and that means take care of maintenance. You've got to take care of your existing system, what we've already spent our money on, before you run out and try to, pave a bunch of new areas. Second, shift more money to transportation alternatives. As I mentioned, people want choices. We're not giving it to them. We've got to be sure that any new money has enough put in it for alternatives. And as part of this advocacy, we got to drive home to the General Assembly. 2 years ago, when they gave them $4 billion, they didn't do enough about how that money was going to be spent, and they didn't get hardly anything other than money from the roads. Third is tying some of that money to some measurable performance criteria. What are we going to get for this money? Right now, it's a blank check to VDOT, to the governor, to do whatever you want to. And we would like, obviously, to tie some of that to see some progress in environmental measures, such as reducing the amount of vehicle pollution, reducing the amount per capita driving or vehicle miles traveled VMT. Fourth, looking at some of the allocation formulas to give regions more flexibility in how they spend, so that it doesn't have to all go to roads or as much to roads if you don't want to, give some more latitude. And then fifth, which has been a big thing we've been fighting, as I mentioned, the last few years, don't raid the general fund. Because that comes directly out of money you have for environmental protection and other things. So that's kind of the framework going forward. As I mentioned, rail funding is a bit of a subset of this discussion, but I do want to mention it separately because there are some question marks about the federal changes in law, and the state might have to pick up a little bit more. But, 2 years ago, the General Assembly created a new fund for passenger rail to try to address this. As I mentioned earlier, last session we actually did pass some budget amendments to put some money in this, but it's just enough to take us through the next 2 years. There is no long-term dedicated source of funding. So there's also a VCN position paper in the book, as I mentioned, on passenger rail. And the key thing there is to support the dedicated source of funding. So we're already starting to see some of the first proposals come out for this session. There's going to be a lot more to hit the table. I just wanted to go through this real quickly because it's gotten a lot of press so far. Gotten some quick early endorsements from some local governments and planning commissions and business community. Is a proposal by Senator John Watkins. I'm not going to go into this in any detail. If any of you have questions, we can talk later. Just wanted to touch on it because it's getting a lot of the press, and it's right now the main thing that people are reacting to. It has a number of moving parts to include increasing the gas tax, a complementary and kind of convoluted measure that would reduce some low-income tax brackets. The idea here is twofold, so that to try to pick up more votes, it's not just a tax hike bill, but it is some tax relief. The other idea and concept behind this is that it would help to offset additional gas tax burden on certain parts of Virginia population and ensure that more of that burden is borne by the state. Now to pay for that part, though, package, to reduce the low-income tax brackets, there's some provisions to eliminate transportation-related tax credits. Now, a number of this, we don't really have a huge dog in the hunt on this, except for some of them we do, such as eliminating clean fuel vehicle tax credits as part of the proposal in the Watkins package. So there's a question mark about the general fund impact. As I mentioned, that's one of our key concerns. Senator Watkins has said there will not be any general fund impact of his proposal, but if you look at the numbers on what's been handed out so far, there's no bill language, just a sheet of talking points. There's a gap of about $33 million a year. So it would come from the general fund. We'll see. But it would raise an appreciable amount of money, and it also has a specific chunk of money set aside for passenger air, which is one of the positive elements of this plan. Sets aside almost $49 million a year. And another interesting provision is no tolling of any existing highways without approval from the General Assembly. So there's an interesting additional policy measure he's put in his plan. Again, didn't want to go into this in too much detail, just wanted you to know about it because it's getting a lot of press. It's getting a lot of attention. It has some interesting elements to it. It's by no means the worst package we've seen in the last few years. And there's another one that just came out recently from Delegate Hugo that is more typical worst package we've seen, which is solely take it from the general fund pretty much. It would hit almost $500 million a year on sales tax. The governor has been kind of coy about what he's going to be proposing, says he's going to have a meaningful, substantial proposal. Who knows? There's a lot of scuttlebutt, a lot of trial balloons kind of floated around out there. We may see something at the Governor's Transportation Conference. It's next week in Northern Virginia. Sometimes he uses that opportunity as a way to announce some things, but it may also be that he doesn't announce it too, but he'll have his budget address in December, so we may see it there. But he has promised a big package. Obviously, that'll shape the debate. There will no doubt be dozens of other transportation funding proposals, but this is just a deeper flavor of some of what we'll be seeing. I mentioned transit allocation. There's a separate issue I just want to flag for people because I think this is a very, very important issue. There was a Senate joint resolution that called for looking at transit performance and allocation. The study that the Department of Rail and Public Transit came back with proposes some pretty significant shifts in authority, and it would allow DRPT and give some power, therefore, to the future administration to alter the allocation criteria of state money among transit providers. So it's kicking up a lot of dust among transit providers. People trying to figure out would they win or lose or whatever. Part of this proposal is to have a comparing peer groups of transit services to see how you're doing one against another. The early versions of this, there were some pretty arbitrary who gets put in what group. Moving to the system among the many concerns of transit providers and the transit advocates community is that it would result in unpredictable levels of funding because the criteria and how you're doing and how it's being assessed could change from year to year, making it very difficult to plan your services in the future. It could hurt a number of systems, make it especially difficult to start any kind of new service. And part of the concern here is that this may be part of an effort to shift money to localities, because if, say, you're a locality that comes out on the short end of the stick and suddenly gets less money, you're faced with the choice of either cutting services or raising revenue. So this might be part of that picture of an attempt to shift some of the cost burden to the state. So it's going to be a significant funding issue this session. Finally, I want to talk very quickly about the Public-Private Transportation Act. I know a number of you are familiar with this. It's a statute Virginia has to try to promote public-private partnerships in building transportation facilities. Virginia has been at the forefront nationally in this effort. There's been a lot of money has been thrown at this. We now have a whole separate Office of Transportation, Public-Private Partnerships. The promise and the idea of it was this is a way to stretch our transportation dollars further by leveraging private sector money and harness the creativity and funding of the private sector. It's increased significantly. It's used the 495 hot lanes that just opened a couple weeks ago actually, is only the fourth PPTA project in which to be completed. There are now, on your count, about 16 or 17 in the pipeline at various stages of planning or development. Billions of taxpayer dollars are now going to these projects, and a number of them involve decades of substantial tolls as part of the agreement. It's gone well beyond this original idea as sort of supplementing our transportation planning process to become really the main way that we're planning transportation for the future. We just released earlier this week a new report looking at the Act and how it's doing. This report was prepared by Jim Regenbaugh. He's a former Senate Finance staff member, has 30 years of analysis background with state policy. It's gotten a lot of press around the state. Encourage you all to visit our website. It gives a lot of good ammunition for some of the problems we've seen with this Act, and we will certainly be drawing upon it this session.
What is the website?
Website is southernenvironment.org. And so I have a few copies with me here today if you're interested, but mainly try not to print a lot of copies, just distribute it electronically. So it's on our website. I encourage you to get it there. We have sent a copy to every member of the General Assembly. We've sent a copy to every member of the Commonwealth Transportation Board. Has gotten a lot of media attention, and we're definitely using it a lot already. Quick summary of some of the problems with this Act and some of the things that are pointed out in this report is that it does undermine our normal transportation planning process. It lets these projects kind of circumvent normal planning. It concentrates a lot of decision-making authority in the governor, takes away a lot of public input, takes away a lot of authority from the General Assembly. It tends to promote projects that have significant environmental impacts, and the deals have tended to result in some pretty sweet deals for the private sector, and as I mentioned, some very long-term tolls for the public. The Midtown-Downtown Tunnel deal, for example, in Hampton Roads has gotten a lot of attention for how that was sprung on the local decision makers and the public with very little input into the particulars of that deal, resulting in decades of very, very high tolls and no alternatives. I mentioned the 460 earlier, the latest version of that funding package, that's a PPDA project. It's a $1.4 billion project. $1.1 billion of that is going to come from taxpayer dollars. The remainder is going to come from tolls. So the whole idea was to leverage private money, but it's all coming out of our pocketbook. So this Act has a lot of serious, serious problems. It has not lived up to its promise. The General Assembly has been very loath to reform it. People of both parties have kind of liked it because it gives them a way to say we're doing something about transportation without raising taxes, but it isn't working. We're not wholly against it. It can work in some limited ways, but we think it needs significant reform. There is a white paper in the briefing book on this, so in terms of solutions, some of the main things that our VCN is calling for, our position is to provide for greater release of public information, especially there's a cost-benefit analysis that the state prepares for each of these projects. The public doesn't get to see it until typically after the agreement's already been signed. We think there should be public hearings before the agreement is signed. Greater role for the General Assembly, especially if you're going to be putting any tolls on projects. Greater role for the Commonwealth Transportation Board. Just a whole number of things, and again, I'm not going to go into all of these, but it's in the book that we have in our briefing book. So, urge you to look there, but a big part of our platform has been there shouldn't be any additional agreement signed under this Act. No additional money should go to it until you reform it. That's really the bottom line. You've got to fix this Act before you use it any further. It's getting, these projects have generated a lot of controversy. The Midtown-Downtown Tunnel has gotten a lot of people to pay more attention to this Act. It was always a little hard, I think, for legislators to follow and people to follow. But now that the tolls are starting to come into bear, I think people are getting it. And one easy way to remember PPDA and get the message across is it stands for the People Pay Tolls Act. Okay, so that's really the quick overview of the session. Things we'll be seeing. Again, I think the funding issues are going to be front and center. We have these sub-issues on rail and transit. PBTA, there may be some broader legislation on just tolling, even if it's not a PBTA reform. The General Assembly is very concerned about, for example, the 95 toll proposal that some of you may be familiar with. That's the basic lay of the land for what we will see this session. The governor's budget is going to come out shortly. General Assembly, and then I had, unfortunately, the wrong lobby day is the 28th of January. So urge you all, appreciate everyone being here today, taking your time out on a Saturday. These are huge stakes for the environment, for our tax dollars, for the future of Virginia. Urge you to stay in touch with the VCN website. Feel free to contact me. We'll be doing a lot on these issues, and they are critical to everything that we care about. Air, water, sprawl, you name it, is connected to our transportation patterns. So what happens in this debate is critically important to all of us, and I thank you all very much.